Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Arnulfo Caro Wash Process Colombia from Shoebox Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Shoebox, based out of Chicago, Illinois. And their coffee roaster that's appeared on the channel on numerous occasions, including our recent review of the Gatuya AA, a wash processed Kenyan coffee. And in that review, I mentioned that we were going to be featuring Shoebox a bit more in the coming months. And the first of the coffees that prompted our interest was this one right here, as it is a chiroso coffee. And we've mentioned in the past that we're making it a point to review more chiroso coffees. And the reason for that is twofold. One, I do want to explore this varietal a little bit more, but the second is that we did have one amazing experience with the Jose Caro. I want to say it was last year from Say, as that was the best chiroso I had had up to that point. And it did show that if the varietal is done very well, then it can be on par with some of our favorite wash processed varietals throughout the entire year. So seeing Shoebox release one definitely caught our interest, so we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 56. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Shoebox's recipe, which is a 16.67 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 92 degrees Celsius. I believe that's about 197 degrees Fahrenheit. I like this one best through the V60, which does indicate a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. Once again, Shoebox does have a reputation for being one of the lighter roasting American coffee roasters out there, and this coffee was no exception, especially based off some of the early experiences that we did have with this one. So the term ultralight is often used when describing Shoebox's coffees, as they definitely do skew on the very light side of things. Definitely one of the lighter roasting coffee roasters out there by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 29, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the coffee was classically Shoebox in that sense, as it did have a prominent grain quality to it, especially off brew. So as mentioned, very light coffees, and there was a little bit of the vanilla characteristic to it as well, which is another thing that we've experienced from previous Shoebox coffees we've had in the past. But the rest does offer a nice balance of citrus and stone fruit intensity, leading to a pretty nice first impression. So let's briefly talk about this varietal. As I mentioned, that there was one time that Jose Caro last year that we enjoyed so much, and that is because it had one of the most well-defined and intense orange-like characteristics from any coffee that we had ever reviewed. And of course, it was a chiroso coffee, but outside of that, the issues we've had with chiroso coffees have been that they can at times be a little spiced, and they can be a bit more lemon citric forward than I would necessarily enjoy. So having this one offer a nice bit of balance to it was a positive first impression, but from that point going forward, it would be kind of interesting, as on day 33 we opted for the Chemex, and it was significantly less impressive this time, as it did feel like this coffee was under extracted. And I have felt in the past that this coffee, or I should say Shoebox's coffees in general, don't necessarily tend to perform well in this brew method, as there are faint traces of peach, but it's not even necessarily grainy. It's just a more overly tame and generic citric experience this time around. So I came to one of two things on it. It probably needed either more time, or it just wasn't an ideal brew method for it. Truth be told, it was probably both. Day 36 to the UFO brewer, and the coffee is improving in terms of intensity, as it has come at the cost of a little bit of a spiced quality. So I do believe I heard Max mention that one of the reasons why Shoebox opted for this coffee was because it was one of the few chirosos that didn't have a lot of these spiced characteristics, and that's been the biggest grievance I've had with chiroso coffees in the past. But on this day, it was there enough to the point where we did notate that. Outside of it, there was more citrus and a little peachiness with less of the graininess, leading to some mixed results. So a little bit all over the board in comparison to the first impression that we've had, but we've had three pretty different experiences with this coffee from the three different brew methods. Day 40 through the V60 with Shoebox's recipe, so 16.67 to 1 at 92 Celsius, and there were more mixed results, as the grain quality has continued to remain present, but little to no of the spiced characteristics. So that's something that we were experiencing a little bit more through the other brew methods, not quite as prominent in the V60. A bit more citric forward today, as the stone fruits are presented in a slightly more subtle sense, so this has also been different to some of the earlier experiences we've had as well. Day 43 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, And the coffee is interesting as of this moment, as it's certainly opened up in terms of the intensity. So we've finally started to see this one probably reached a point where it would be ideal to start brewing it, at least from the results that we've had. Day 43, so what does that indicate? 6 weeks or so. And in this day, we had much more of a non-traditional coffee fruit sense to it, as it did remind me a little bit of a persimmon in terms of the sweetness. Outside of that, there's a fair bit of a sugary quality that has less of the spice and grain characteristics, but a little bit more of the citric component to it. So pretty interesting regardless. And on day 47, we opted for the V60 with Shoebox's recipe, and a little bit more fine of a grind. I did kind of want to push it a little bit in that sense. And it was definitely the best day we'd experienced of this coffee up to this point, as it does have better intensity to the fruit characteristics. So again, I do feel like it's a number of factors. Primarily, a lot of rest was really going to help this coffee, as it does have less of the graininess, and that's been consistent with the results we've had from Shoebox in the past, is that they probably do need a fair bit of time, and it's often worth revisiting their coffees after we've finished reviewing the coffees, because they do tend to turn out better in that time. Outside of that, there's more of a strong sugary fruit quality to it in a much more pronounced sense. So it does continue to remind me, interestingly, of that persimmon. And what's the note that they have listed on here? I want to say it's something like a kumquat. And I am not going to lie to you, I have no idea what a kumquat tastes like, but the other characteristics, the lemongrass, I don't see as much, largely because I think the lemongrass that I have imprinted on me is the vast majority of, say, coffees from 4 years ago that were just super lemongrass forward. And this one, I think it's just a better citrus. I never really liked the way that lemongrass presented in coffee. And the peachiness is a little bit more subtle, but it's there. There's plenty of stone fruit. So there's depth in terms of this coffee, but at times it can be skewing a little bit more in one direction versus the other. Day 50 through the chemics with the same adjustments. And there has been consistency in the sense that as of it reached that day 43 mark, that 6-week mark, we're just seeing a lot more of the sugary fruit characteristics to it, this time in a more orange-yellow tone. It does feel slightly subdued in terms of the brightness as well as the sweetness. Both are relatively moderate through this brew method, but I already mentioned that we just seem to struggle brewing a lot of Shoebox's coffees through this brew method. Day 53. Final notes we have through the V60 with Shoebox's recipe, and it has been pretty consistent from that week 6 mark going forward, as there's a very subtle white tea characteristic to it. So I made it a point to go about more of the qualities that we were experiencing as opposed to the just kind of citric and stone fruit forward experiences, as it's accompanied by a very soft apple tartness to go with the prominent citric qualities as well, and those traces of stone fruits. A little bit of a pineapple vanilla shake is kind of the best way I describe this coffee on this day, as it does continue to remain primarily citric forward, but citric forward a little bit more in a sweeter citric sense, a little bit more of a sugary citric sense. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 4 level 4s. Let's go through those. We will start with the cleanliness level 4. Certainly nothing whatsoever to take away from the overall cleanliness of this coffee. As you'd expect, the vast majority of coffees we've had from Shoebox have been on the cleaner side of things. I don't think we've actually scored anything outside of the level 4 up to this point. The issue I can have with their coffees is that some of the earlier days it does have that grainy characteristic, but that always seems to dissipate over time, and that was the case with this coffee, but it was never in jeopardy of scoring anything lower than that level 4. Finish level 4. The vast majority of the time, it did seem to linger in that citric sense, but again, lemongrass just isn't something that I would necessarily associate with this coffee. It does present a little bit more sweet, so I have no issue with that being at the level 4, especially given that it is much more of the type of citrus that I would prefer in a coffee like this. Sweetness level 4. I already mentioned there's that vanilla characteristic, and I think that once again it is the roaster that Shoebox uses, because I continue to find that same vanilla characteristic from a lot of their coffees. There's going to be an exception or two going forward, but I think largely the Panamanian coffees that we'd reviewed from them in the past, and the Kenyan coffee is obviously an exception because they're mostly dominated by the Kenyan characteristics, but a coffee like this that isn't necessarily the most intense to begin with, it can have that characteristic to it, which I think helps. Just gives it a little bit more depth. I love drum roasters, so that's one of the main reasons why I've been a big fan of Shoebox, is because they do have the type of profile I enjoy with the type of roasting machine that I do enjoy as well. So happy with the sweetness there at the level 4. It does come in that sense, as well as the fruit characteristics that have just a little bit more sweetness to them. Citrus fruit level 4. I'm trying to think. I honestly don't know enough about, what is it? Kumquats? I keep forgetting. I think it's kumquat. And the persimmon that I mentioned. I don't know which category those would fall into, but outside of that, I mean, it does have that orange yellow tone, and that's why I kept going back to persimmon, because persimmon, that's the fruit that I think just the color tone of this coffee reminded me of the most. And I think that falls into the citrus fruit category. I really don't know. But even outside of that, there's that yellow orange tone. So more of that pineapple characteristic that gives this one that level 4 in the citrus category. Let's go ahead and move on. Acidity level 3. I do kind of wonder how others experience that. And my assumption with this coffee is that with really light profiled coffees, oftentimes the acidity and brightness can be subdued. And I think keeping the extraction a little bit lower on the coffees that we brew from Shoebox, as well as those lower temperatures, I think does play a role in keeping the brightness subdued as well, because level 3 is where we opted to put that. Same thing with the florality level 3. I wouldn't necessarily say that there's a very prominent floral sense to it. There's a more of a citric blossom floral quality to it, which wasn't even necessarily worth mentioning too often, largely because I think it was definitely nowhere near as prominent as the fruit quality characteristics of this one. You can also align the vanilla characteristic to that florality, but I think it's just more of a citric blossom floral characteristic. Stone fruit level 3. I mentioned there are the traces of peach, and when we were able to experience those, it was very enjoyable, but I would definitely say it took a pretty significant backseat to the citric components of this coffee. And then I think that there's only one other thing worth discussing. Well, two, I guess. Not just one. Body level 2, as this one right here does have a lighter body to it. I think when it comes to chiroso coffees, I haven't found a consistent experience where I can say for certain that they're a little bit lighter body, a little bit more medium body, but this one right here just came out a little bit lighter in that sense. There was one other thing I wanted to mention real quick, and that's kind of what I was looking at, is the spice characteristic, because there was one day, especially on the earlier days, where it was a little bit more prominent. But as far as chiroso coffees go, this one definitely had a lack of that, which is definitely a win for me. And again, I think it was one of the primary catalysts for getting this coffee to begin with. So yeah, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, I would say positive. As mentioned, the experiences we've had with chiroso coffees since we started reviewing chiroso coffees has been all over the board, with some that I haven't enjoyed whatsoever, and one that was extremely impressive. And I would say that this one skews closer to the better side of things. I wouldn't necessarily say it was as enjoyable as that Jose Caro, and that's because, again, that Jose Caro was just so unbelievably clean and well-defined in the sense that it was, that it made for one of the most unique experiences that we've had with any coffee that we've had from Say over the last couple of years in general. So this one right here, it does have some nice peaks, and I feel like maybe giving this coffee a little bit more rest would bring those out in a better, more intense and defined sense. But for the way that we brewed this coffee and the amount of time that we worked on this coffee, I feel like there was just more potential to be had, which seems to be the case with Substances, or I should say Shoebox's coffees. And I feel like maybe we should do what we've done with Shoebox recently, and that's try one of their coffees at a 60-day mark, like start working it on a 60-day mark and see where it goes from there, because I do imagine that this coffee is probably going to be better in a couple of weeks. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's an interesting one if you've been curious about chiroso coffees, and I feel like it offers enough of those characteristics, primarily citric forward and just that slight bit of the spice at times, to kind of give you the experience while still playing it safe. It does have some positives in terms of the fruit profiles and characteristics while still maintaining great cleanliness and sweetness to it, all of which encompass in a very light profile. So I feel like that's kind of the best direction to point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Arnulfo Caro wash process Colombia from Shoebox Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.